Today's lesson we're talking about properties, and so I just want to do a quick review just like I would on the whiteboard in class. I'm going to do a quick review online here of me just kind of walking you through the properties that you took in your notes. You should have your notes still out so you can look at them and kind of re-hear some of the material again. The first property that I want to talk about is the commutative property. The commutative property, the way that I remember the commutative property is every day I drive to and from school on work days. So home to school, school to home. No matter which way I go, home to school or school to home, the distance is the same. And we call that drive, home to school, school to home, my daily commute. My daily commute is home to school, school to home. And so my daily commute, it doesn't matter which direction I go, what order I go in, the distance stays the same. And so the commutative property says that whether I do 1 plus 2 or 2 plus 1, things are the same. So the commutative property says that I can add in any order. So the commutative property of addition says I can add in any order. The commutative property of multiplication says the same thing. It says that I can multiply in any order. 2 times 3 equals 3 times 2. These are some examples of the commutative property. The top is the commutative property of addition. The bottom is the commutative property of multiplication. My daily commute, home to school, school to home, 1 plus 2 equals 2 plus 1. We can go in any order and it still works. We can also use variables. So for example, I could do x plus a equals a plus x if I wanted. That's another way to show the commutative property of addition. After the commutative property today, I want to talk about the associative property. The way I remember the associative property is who I associate with is who I group myself with. Who I group with is who I associate with. Those are my friend groups. And so the associative property is when grouping changes. And so the associative property of addition says that if I have 1 plus 2 in parentheses plus 3, that's equal to 1 plus in parentheses 2 plus 3. So I'm going to show you this on my board. You'll notice that in these two situations, grouping is shown with parentheses. 1 and 2 are buddied up here, and then over here 2 and 3 are buddied up. So who the number 2 associates with changes based on where the parentheses are. This is the associative property of addition. The associative property of multiplication is very similar. I'm going to use variables for this. For example, A times B times C equals A times B times C. Notice that order does not change. The commutative property, order changed. That was when order changed. The associative property, order stays the same. A, B, C, A, B, C. But grouping is what changes. Who I associate with or who I group with is different. Here the parentheses A and B are buddied up. Here parentheses are B and C are buddied up. So that is the associative property. The next thing that you talked about in your notes was the identity property. My identity is who I am as a person. Who I identify as is who I am. And so when we talk about the identity property, we're saying that a number is going to stay the same whether we add 0 or multiply by 1. So for the identity, who that number is or what that number is not going to change. So that's how I remember the identity property. In the identity property of addition, for example, we start with 10. 10 plus 0 is equal to 10. The number 10's identity did not change even though we added 0. It stayed 0 no matter what. The identity property of multiplication says that 10 times 1 is equal to 10. When we multiply by 1, the identity 10 stays the same. It does not change. So this is the identity property of addition and the identity property of multiplication. The identity of 10 did not change even after we added 0 or multiplied by 1. This can also be true of variables. We could use a variable instead. We could say, for example, b plus 0 is equal to b, or b times 0 is equal to b. Any of these properties can be shown using numbers or variables or a mixture of them both. So at the identity property, it looks like b plus 0 is still b. B stayed the same even though we added 0. B times 1 was equal to B. B stayed the same. Its identity did not change. So that's the identity property. We're almost done. The next one that I have is the inverse property. Inverse, remember, means opposite. When we talked about solving equations, inverse meant opposites. And so this is the one where we're going to have positive and negative numbers. For example, -5 plus 5 equals 0. They cancel each other out. If I'm $5 in debt and I pay $5 back to that person, now I owe them $0. With variables, we could say -y plus positive y equals 0. Negative y and positive y are inverses. They are opposites. And so the inverse property just says that when we add opposites, the answer is 0. That's how we recognize the inverse property of addition. The last one is the distributive property. This one is sometimes the toughest one for students to understand. The distributive property looks like this. It has something like 3 with a letter on the inside of parentheses times x plus 2. And the distributive property, distribute means to share out. So the distributive property shares this 3 with everything on the inside of parentheses using multiplication. 3 times x is 3x. I bring the plus sign over, and 3 times 2 is 6. And so I get 3x plus 6. The distributive property starts with parentheses, and then it shares everything, so there's no longer parentheses. That's how I recognize the distributive property. It starts with parentheses and ends with none. That's normally a dead giveaway that we're talking about the distributive property when I'm trying to distinguish it from other properties. So it takes the outside number and it multiplies it by everything on the inside. 3 times x is 3x, and 3 times 2 is 6. And so I've got 3x plus 6. And this is the distributive property. It says that when I share the outside number with everything on the inside using multiplication, I can get rid of parentheses. That's sometimes how we simplify. So we have all kinds of properties that we've talked about. Your job is to commit them to memory. You're going to have to relearn these tricks that I've given you. The commutative property is my daily commute, home to school, school to home, order changes. The associative property is who I associate with is who I group with. That's when parentheses change, those groupings change. The identity property, who I identify as, is who I am no matter what. So whether you add 0 or multiply by 1, that number stays the same. That identity doesn't change. The inverse property, inverse means opposites. So when we add opposites, we get 0. And then the distributive property is when we share the outside number with everything, we distribute the outside number or share it with everything on the inside, and it eliminates parentheses. So those are kind of the tricks that I give you to help memorize, but basically you're going to be spending today memorizing these properties so that at the end you can do the exit slip using your notes to match 5 properties with their expression or equation.